Blind Tiger. Written by Sandra Brown. Read by Jason Culp. March 1920.
Won't be much longer.
Derby had been telling her that for the past 2 hours. He said the same 4 words at intervals that had become so regular she could now predict to within a minute the next repetition. His tone was terse and emphatic, as though he were trying to convince himself. Laurel had stopped responding because whatever she said, he took as an affront. He sat hunched over the steering wheel, his shoulders stacked with so much tension they were nearly touching his earlobes. They had gotten a late start, not leaving Sherman until past noon. Since the day had been half gone, and daylight with it, she had suggested they wait until tomorrow to set out, but Derby had stubbornly stuck to his plan.
My old man's expecting us. I didn't spend good money on a telegram telling him when we were coming, only to be no-shows.
It wasn't a trip to be making with an infant just barely a month old. She certainly hadn't expected to be uprooted with only a few hours' notice, but here they were, Derby, her, and baby Pearl, driving through the night. The farther they traveled, the more concerned she became about their welfare. Derby had told her that his father lived roughly 150 miles southwest of Sherman. He had showed her on a map the route they would take. Until today, she had never been on a road trip in an automobile, but she hadn't counted on it taking the 6+ hours they'd been traveling to cover 150 miles. She was huddled inside her coat, the lower half of her face wrapped in a muffler, a cap hugging her head. But even bundled up as she was, she had kept careful track of the highway signs. Freezing precipitation made them difficult to spot unless the T-model's one working headlight caught them at a good angle. They were still on the right highway, but how much farther could it possibly be? Or maybe, in order to avoid a quarrel, Derby had fudged on the distance. To be fair, though, neither of them had counted on the abrupt change in the weather. North Texas had enjoyed a reasonably mild winter through Christmas and New Year, but the Farmer's Almanac had predicted a spring that would be colder than usual, with hard freezes expected well into mid-March. This was day 2 of the month, and it had come in like a lion. They'd just reached the western outskirts of Dallas when the norther had caught up to them. The leading gust of frigid air had broadsided the Tin Lizzie like a runaway freight train. She wouldn't be surprised to learn that the first buffet had left a dent in the car door. Not that another dent would be noticed. It was already banged up. The day Derby had driven the car home, she had been flabbergasted by his impulsiveness. When she'd asked where he'd gotten it, he'd told her about a former war buddy who lived in a town nearby.
He hadn't been in France a month when the poor bastard lost his left leg clean up to here.
He'd made a slice across his groin.
Can't work the pedals to drive. He let me have this beauty for a song.
They didn't have a song, but she hadn't pointed that out, because in that boastful moment, some of Derby's rakish charm, which had attracted her to him in the first place, had resurfaced. He'd swung open the passenger door and made a sweeping gesture with his arm as he bowed.
Your chariot awaits, Ms. Plummer.
He'd winked and grinned, and she'd seen a flash of the dashing young man who had marched off to fight the Great War, rather than the quarrelsome stranger who had returned from it. She'd seized on his sudden lightheartedness and had giggled helplessly as he'd driven them through town, going faster than he should, and needlessly honking at everything and everybody, making her laugh harder. He'd seemed mindless of the jostling until one pothole sent her bouncing so hard in her seat, she placed her hands protectively over her belly. "Careful of those chuck holes, or the baby might pop out of me like a cork from a bottle." She had gone into labor that very night. By 3 o'clock the following afternoon, she was a mother and Derby a father. That had been 4 weeks ago. At first, Derby had been prideful and happy and solicitous to her and their baby girl, but the newness of fatherhood had soon worn off, and the grinning man who'd taken her on the joyride retreated once more behind a perpetual scowl she couldn't allay. In the 30 or so days since Pearl's entrance into the world, Derby had lost another job. He'd spent a lot of time away from the house and snapped at her whenever she'd inquired where he'd been. In a heartbeat, he would become testy and short-tempered. She never knew what to expect. During supper last evening, out of the clear blue, he'd announced,
"We're moving to Foley."
He'd avoided looking at her by keeping his head bent over his meal. Afraid to overreact, she'd blotted her mouth with her napkin. "I think I've heard of it. Isn't it near?"
"It's not near anything, but my old man's found me work out there."
She had actually felt a spark of hopefulness.
"Really? That's wonderful. Doing what?"
"Does it matter? He's expecting us tomorrow."
The floor, none too level already, had seemed to undulate beneath her chair.
"Tomorrow?"
Pearl was a fussy baby who demanded to be nursed several times a night. For a month, Laurel hadn't slept for more than a couple of hours at a time. She was exhausted, worried about Derby's state of mind, worried about their shortage of money, and now this. Leaving half his supper uneaten, he'd shoved back his chair, left the table, and lifted his jacket off the peg near the back door.
"Back tonight. I want to get away early."
"Wait, Derby, we can't just—"
Words had failed her.
"Sit back down, please. We need to talk about this."
"What's to talk about?"
She gaped at him with bafflement.
"Everything. Do we have a place to live?"
"I wouldn't up and move you and the baby without having a plan, would I?"
"It just seems awfully sudden."
"Well, it's not. I've been thinking on it for a time."
"You should have talked it over with me."
"I'm talking it over with you now."
His raised voice had caused Pearl to flinch, where she lay asleep in Laurel's lap. Laurel had lifted her to her shoulder and patted her back. Derby's expression had turned impatient, but whether at her, the baby, or himself, she'd been unable to tell.
"I've got some things to see to before we clear town. Rent's due on this place the day after tomorrow. I'll leave notice of our departure in the landlord's mailbox."
He'd reached for the doorknob.
"Derby, hold on."
She'd gone over to him.
"I welcome the idea of us making a fresh start. I just want it to be a good fresh start. Thought through, not so rushed."
"I told you, I have been thinking on it."
"But making a move to another town seems drastic. When you talked to Mr. Davis, he told you that he might have an opening at his store soon."
"Scooping chicken feed into tow sacks?"
He'd made a sour face.
"No thanks."
"Something else could—"
"There's nothing for me here, Laurel. Anyway, it's decided. We're leaving."
He'd pulled open the door and said over his shoulder as he went out,
"You'd better get started packing."
He hadn't returned home until after 2 o'clock in the morning, disheveled and red-eyed, reeking of bootleg whiskey, too drunk to stand without support. When he'd stumbled into the bedroom, he'd propped himself against the door jamb and blearily focused on her where she'd sat in the rocking chair next to the bed, nursing Pearl.
"Things ready?"
he'd asked in a mumble. Their duplex had rented furnished, so there hadn't been much to pack except for their clothing and her personal possessions, which were few in number and didn't amount to anything. In answer to his question, she'd motioned to the 2 suitcases lying open on the floor. She'd carefully folded his army uniform and laid it on top. Laurel had eased Pearl away from her breast and tucked it back inside her nightgown.
"Couldn't we give this decision a week, talk it over some more?"
"I'm sick of talking."
He'd staggered to the bed, crawled onto it, and passed out. He'd slept late and had been irritable and hungover when he woke up. Laurel had wished he'd forgotten about their departure, about the whole harebrained idea. But he'd fortified himself with several cups of strong coffee and a dozen hand-rolled cigarettes, and by the time she'd packed them a lunch, with what food was left in the icebox, Derby was impatient to be off. While he was loading their suitcases, putting one in the trunk and strapping down the other on top of it, she'd walked through the duplex one final time checking to see that nothing belonging to them had been overlooked. Derby had hung his army uniform back in the closet. The top on the Ford was up, which kept some of the frozen precipitation off them, but it was open air. During the whole trip, Laurel had kept Pearl clutched to her chest inside her coat, inside her dress, wanting to be skin to skin with her. She was afraid the baby would freeze to death, and she wouldn't even know it because she was so numb with cold herself. But Pearl had nursed well her last feeding, and her breath had remained reassuringly humid and warm.
Won't be much longer.
Laurel held her tongue. This time, Derby added,
The crossroads is up ahead. He's only a few miles past that.
However, beyond the crossroads, the road narrowed and the pavement gave way to gravel. The surrounding darkness was unrelieved, except for the faulty headlight that blinked intermittently like a distress signal from a foundering ship. So when Laurel caught a flicker of light out of the corner of her right eye, she first thought it was the headlight reflecting off pellets of blowing sleet. But she squinted through the precipitation and then gave a soft cry of desperate hope.
Derby, could that be his place?
Where?
Up there. I thought I saw a light.
He slowed down and looked in the direction she indicated.
Gotta be,
he muttered. He put the car in low gear and turned onto a dirt track formed by tire treads. The sleet made it look like it had been salted. The Model T ground its way up the incline. At a higher elevation, the north wind was vicious. Howling, it lashed against the car as Derby brought it to a stop. Whatever relief Laurel might have felt evaporated when she saw the dwelling beyond the windshield. It could be described only as a shack. Light seeped through vertical slits in the walls made of weathered lumber. On the south side of the structure, the roof steeply sloped downward and formed an extension that provided cover for stacked firewood. She didn't say anything, and Derby avoided looking at her. He pushed open the driver's door against the fierce wind and climbed out. A fan of light spread onto the ground in front of him as the door to the shack came open. Derby's father was silhouetted, so Laurel couldn't make out his features, but she was heartened by the welcoming tone of his voice as he shouted into the wind, "I'd about given up on you." He waved Derby forward. Less enthusiastically, Derby approached his father and shook hands. They exchanged a few words, which Laurel couldn't hear. Derby's father jerked his head backward, then he leaned to one side in order to see around Derby and peered at the car. Derby did a quick about-face, came over to the passenger door, opened it, and motioned Laurel out.
Hurry, it's cold.
Her legs almost gave out beneath her when she stepped onto the ground. Derby took her elbow and closed the car door. Together, they made their way to the open doorway where her father-in-law had stepped aside for them. Derby hustled her inside, then firmly shut the door. The wind continued to roar. Or, Laurel wondered, was the roaring in her ears actually caused by the sudden silence, or her weariness and gnawing hunger? All that, she assumed, plus the alarming and humiliating realization that she and Pearl had not been expected.
Daddy, this is my wife, Laurel. I'll get the suitcases.
With no more ceremony than that, Derby left them. There was little resemblance between Derby and his father, who was half a head shorter and didn't have Derby's lanky build. The crescent of his baldness was so precise it could have been traced from a pattern. The hair around it was wiry and gray and grew straight out from his head like brush bristles. His eyebrows looked like twin caterpillars stuck to his forehead. They assessed each other. She said,
"Mr. Plummer?"
Clearing her throat of self-conscious scratchiness, she added,
Pleased to meet you.
Laurel, he said.
Yes, sir.
We're kin now, so I expect you ought to drop the sir and call me Irv.
She gave him a faint smile, and some of the tension in her chest eased. Pearl squirmed inside her coat, drawing his notice.
That the baby? What's its name?
Laurel unbuttoned her coat, lifted Pearl out, and transferred her to the crook of her elbow.
Her name is Pearl."
He didn't step closer, but tentatively leaned forward and inspected what he could see of Pearl, which wasn't much, swaddled as she was, and considering the meager light provided by a kerosene lantern that hung from a hook in the low ceiling. He appeared to be pleased enough with his granddaughter because he smiled, but all he said was, "Well, how about that?" Then he turned away and went over to a pot-bellied stove. Laurel noticed that he favored his left leg, making his bow-legged gait even more lopsided. He opened the door to the stove and tossed in 2 split logs he took from the stack of firewood against the wall. He came back around, dusting his hands. "Y'all are hungry, I expect. I've got a rabbit fried up, fresh killed and dressed this morning. I've kept a batch of biscuits warm. I was waiting till Derby got here to make the gravy." Laurel's stomach had been growling for the past several hours, but to be polite, she said,
"I hate that you've gone to so much trouble."
"No trouble. Coffee's—" The door burst open, and Derby came in with their suitcases. He dropped them at his sides and pushed the door closed with his heel. Irv said to him, "Move over there, closer to the stove. I'll pour you all some coffee."
Got any hooch? Or are you abiding by the new law of the land, even though it's horseshit?
Looking displeased by his son's crudity, Irv glanced at Laurel, then walked over to a small chest that had only 3 legs. In place of the missing one was a stack of catalogs with faded, curled, dusty covers. He grunted as he went down on his right knee. He opened the bottom drawer, reached far back into it, and came out with a mason jar that was 2/3 full of clear liquid. As he heaved himself up, he said, "Sometimes my hip gets to bothering me so's I can't sleep. A nip of shine helps." Derby reached for the jar without so much as a thank you. He uncapped it and took a swig. The corn liquor must have seared his gullet. When he lowered the jar, his eyes were watering. Laurel was already furious at him. Weren't their present circumstances dreadful enough without his getting drunk? She didn't conceal the resentment in her voice when she told him she needed the necessary. Irv said, "Around back, 20 paces or so. You can lay the baby down over there." He nodded toward a mattress on the floor in the corner. "Take a lantern, Derby." Laurel didn't want to leave Pearl, but not having any choice, she laid her on the mattress. The ticking looked reasonably clean compared to the hard-packed dirt floor. She wrapped the baby tightly in her blankets, hoping that a varmint wouldn't crawl into them before she returned. Between taking sips of moonshine, Derby had lit a lantern. Bracing herself for the brutal cold, Laurel followed him out. It had started to snow, and it was sticking. She was glad Derby was with her to help her find her way, but she was too angry to speak to him. She went into the foul-smelling outhouse and relieved herself as quickly as she could. When she emerged, Derby passed the lantern to her.
Get back inside. I'm gonna have a smoke.
"It's freezing out here."
I'm gonna have a smoke.
"And finish that," she said,
glaring at the fruit jar.
I'm sick of you nagging me about every goddamn thing.
"As if things aren't bad enough, you're going to get skunk drunk?"
He smirked.
Thought it would.
He raised the jar to his mouth, but she slapped it aside, almost knocking it out of his hand.
Do as I tell you, Laurel. Go inside.
"Your daddy didn't know about Pearl and me, did he?"
When he just stared back at her, she shouted,
"Did he?"
No.
Even though she wasn't surprised, hearing him admit it caused her to see red.
"How could you do this to me, Derby? To Pearl? To all of us? Why in the world did you bring us here?"
I had to do something with you first.
"First?"
You'll thank me later.
He produced a pistol from the pocket of his coat, put it beneath his chin, and pulled the trigger. 2. Laurel's father-in-law waited until daylight and the worst of the storm had blown itself out to notify the authorities. Before leaving for town, he made her swear that she would stay inside the shack while he was gone. Listlessly, she agreed to remain inside, having no desire to subject herself to see in the dreary gray daylight what she had beheld in darkness. She hadn't even known that Derby owned a pistol. In Irv's absence, she sat on the mattress near the pot-bellied stove where she had endured the long night, benumbed by what Derby had done. She held Pearl to her the entire time, her infant being the only thing that seemed real, the one thing she could cling to in this ongoing nightmare. She couldn't even take comfort in fond memories of Derby. Those she'd cherished had died with him. They'd been obliterated by what would be her final memory of him. She resented him for that. Irv returned, followed by the sheriff and the justice of the peace. They came into the shack and spoke to her briefly, but there was little she could say that would make the circumstances any clearer than the gore they'd seen splashed onto the door of the outhouse. After Derby's body had been removed and taken to the funeral parlor, Irv dismantled the outhouse and burned it. By the early dusk, he had built another enclosure. He probably wouldn't have been so industrious on the day after his son's suicide if it hadn't been for the privacy Laurel required. Now, less than 24 hours after meeting her father-in-law, they were alone in the shack, except for Pearl. He was at the cook stove, preparing food she didn't think she could eat, but knew she must in order to sustain Pearl.
Thank you for replacing the outhouse.
Easier to start over than try to clean the old one. He'd made a goddamn mess.
Softly, she said,
He wasn't right in his mind.
He turned away from the stove and looked over at her.
Shell shock?
I suppose. A light had gone out inside him, and it never came back on. I thought he would get better as time passed. I tried to help him, but he wouldn't even talk about it.
Irv dragged one hand down his creased face.
He was like that after his mama died. Shut down, like. He ever tell you about that?
No.
TB got her. Derby was 7, 8. Had to watch her decline, then die. That's tough on a kid.
He paused, lost in thought, then cleared his throat.
After she passed, I couldn't earn a living and look after him at the same time. I had no choice but to put him in a home. For what it was a nice place, subsidized by the railroad. I'd go see him whenever I could, but...
He raised his shoulders.
He never forgave me for leaving him. Soon as he was old enough, he went his own way. I'd hear from him off and on, mostly off. But it seemed to me like he'd found himself again and was doing all right. Then the war came along. If it was as bad as they say, it's a wonder any of them who survived it haven't done what he did.
He heaved a sigh that invoked Laurel's pity. The wretched memory of Derby's death would stay with Irv until his own final breath.
Can I help you there? She asked.
No thanks. I'm just making some gravy for that rabbit we didn't eat last night. It's almost ready.
Pearl was sleeping peacefully on the mattress. She probably needed to be changed, but in the process she would wake up. Right now it was better for Laurel, as well as for the baby, that she remain asleep, because Laurel needed time to think. She was viewing her life as a spool of ribbon that had gotten away from her, rolling out of her reach, unwinding rapidly and haphazardly, and she was powerless to stop it. She shivered, as much from despair as from the cold air that seeped through the cracks in the walls of the shack. She hadn't removed her coat since she arrived. Shoving her hands deep into its pockets, she said,
Right before he did it, Derby admitted that he hadn't told you about me and Pearl.
Irv set down the long spoon he was using and turned toward her.
He didn't even tell me he'd survived the war.
Derby and she had still been in a honeymoon haze when he had left for overseas. She would have gone crazy if she hadn't received periodic letters from him. Usually they were filled with cryptic references to his misery, but at least she'd known that he was alive. Learning that Derby hadn't extended his father that courtesy made her heartsick for the old man.
That was terribly thoughtless of him.
I got one letter telling me he'd been drafted and was going to Europe to kill Huns. I moved around a lot for work, so he'd been long gone by the time that letter caught up with me. Armistice came and went without a word from him. I took that as a bad sign, but the military is supposed to let folks back home know when their loved one has fallen or is missing, right? So I went up to Camp Bowie, where he'd been stationed before shipping out. After a lot of rigmarole and sorting through red tape, I was told he'd made it back stateside. His last paycheck from the Army had been mailed to a post office box in Sherman. I wrote to him there just to tell him where I'd lit in case he ever wanted to find me. He took in the rustic interior of the shack as though seeing it from her perspective for the first time. She followed the track of his eyes. Cobwebs laced the rafters that were blackened from age and smoke. A cowhide that looked like it had mange was nailed to the north wall. She supposed that it wasn't so much for decoration as to keep out the elements. The flue of the pot-bellied stove was piecemeal, forming a leaky and crooked outlet to the hole in the ceiling. "Ain't much," he said. Laurel didn't detect any degree of humility or apology in that statement, and she couldn't help but admire him for that. He gave the simmering gravy a stir. "I didn't hear anything from Derby until the telegram office sent a boy out here day before yesterday. All it said was that he was coming, nothing more." Laurel dug at a crack in the dirt floor with the toe of her shoe. There was no job, no work waiting for him, was there? He shifted his weight, redistributing it unevenly, placing more on the right side of his body. "There's work around." "Of what kind?" "Same as me." "Forgive me, Mr. Plummer, but Irv.
Irv, what kind of work do you do?"
"I was a railroad man, over 30 years at it. Went all over, repairing tracks. That's how I got the bum hip."
He patted his left leg joint.
"Coupler backed into it. Didn't stop me from working, though, just made it harder. But I got old and tired, so I stopped railroading several years ago and settled into this place. Now I do odd jobs in and around town."
He looked over at her with something of a grin.
"I guess you could say I'm a fix-it man."
"Are there enough things around here that need fixing to keep you busy?"
And solvent? She wanted to ask that, but didn't.
"I'm stretched pretty thin, all right."
He set tin plates and cutlery on the small table, which was not much larger than a checkerboard.
"How much had Derby told you about me? Not much good, I reckon."
"He hadn't told me anything, except that you were still living, as far as he knew. He said the two of you weren't close."
He gave a sad nod.
"Well, then at least that didn't come as a shock to you."
"What caused the rift?"
He pursed his lips thoughtfully, then said,
"His mama died young."
He gave the gravy another stir.
"What about you? Is your family up in North Texas?"
"Yes, my daddy and uncle grow cotton. Or did. The last 3 crops got ruined by the boll weevil."
"You want to notify your folks of this?"
She took a breath, wishing she could postpone this, but reasoned that he needed to know sooner rather than later.
"We don't speak."
He came around and studied her for a moment, then asked,
"Was it Derby that split y'all up?"
He must have seen the answer in her expression, because he said,
"Figured."
"The blame wasn't all his. The split was my daddy's doing. He's a hard man. He disapproved of Derby's sinful ways."
"Drinking and dancing?"
She huffed a laugh.
"To my daddy's mind, even a game of dominoes will send you to hell. Derby enjoyed egging him on. One day, Daddy had enough and put his foot down. He told me that Derby's sinfulness was rubbing off on me, and that if I married him, no one in my family would be allowed to utter my name again, not ever. It would be as though I'd never been born."
She gazed down at her sleeping daughter, relieved that her stern, intolerant father would never exercise any influence over her.
"Fine," I told him. "I didn't want to be a member of a family so wrathful and unloving. Both of us meant what we said. Mama, of course, had to go along with Daddy."
Her mother's plight made Laurel sad. She'd been cowed into letting Laurel go without a quibble, but there was no help for that. Her mother, taking seriously her submissive role, had made her bed, and she would die in it. Suddenly, it occurred to Laurel that she unwittingly had been taking that same path. If she hadn't yielded to Derby's irrational decision, hadn't gone dumbly along for harmony's sake, she wouldn't be in this predicament. Her father-in-law was saying, "Maybe, after what's happened, your folks will take you back. I'm happy to drive you up there."
"No," she said swiftly and firmly. "Thank you for offering, but I won't go back."
Irv rubbed his bristly chin, looked down at Pearl, then at Laurel.
"Well then, looks like you're staying."
3. May 1920. Thatcher had worn out his welcome. He knew it, although he tried not to act like he did. He lay on his back, using his duffel bag as a pillow, fingers linked over his stomach, fedora covering his face. He pretended to be asleep. He was far from it. He was acutely aware of everything going on inside the boxcar, the atmosphere of which had turned ripe to the stinking point with hostility. Beneath him, the wheels of the train rhythmically clickety-clacked over the rails, but their noisy cadence didn't drown out the snores of the 3 men sharing the freight car with him. Thatcher didn't trust their snorts and snuffles. They were too irregular and loud. Like him, they were playing possum, waiting for an opportunity to spring. The door to the car had been left partially open to provide them fresh air. The gap was no wider than a few feet, 3, 4 at best. Once he made his move, he couldn't hesitate. He would get only one chance, so within a second or two of moving, he'd have to make a clean jump through that slim gap. If he didn't make it out, a fight was inevitable. 3 against 1. Bad odds in any contest. Until fate had put them together on this train, they'd been strangers to him and to one another. But last night, somewhere between coastal Louisiana and wherever they were now, the other 3 had become unified against him. The last thing he wanted was a damned fight. He'd fought in one, a bloody one. He'd been on the winning side of it, but victory hadn't felt as glorious as people had let on. To his mind, the loss of so many men and women wasn't a fit reason to hold parades. No, he wouldn't welcome a fight, but if he had to defend himself, he would, and he wouldn't fight fair. He hadn't cheated death in France to die in this railroad car that reeked of its cargo of yellow onions and unwashed men. One advantage the other 3 had over him was that they weren't new to riding freights. He was the amateur. But he'd listened to their idle conversation, had paid attention, had sifted the facts out of the bullshit. They jawed about the station masters who were charitable and looked the other way when they spotted a hobo, and others who were die-hard company men. By the rules, sons of bitches, who were well known up and down the line for showing no mercy to men they caught hitching a ride. Thatcher's plan had been to wait until the train began to slow on the outskirts of the next town and to get off before it reached the depot, in case the station master there happened to be one of the less tender-hearted. But these men, who were seasoned in the art, were probably expecting him to do just that. No doubt their plan was to jump him before he could jump from the train. They were on a track that cut across the broad breast of Texas, where towns were few and far between. But within the last few minutes, Thatcher had decided that no matter how desolate the landscape was where he landed, it would be safer than staying in this boxcar and at the mercy of men who didn't have anything left to lose. Jumping from a moving train couldn't be much worse than being thrown from a horse, could it? He'd been pitched off too many times to count. But he'd never been thrown when it was full dark, when he didn't know his exact location or where his next drink of water would come from. How long till daylight? He didn't dare check his wristwatch. The Army invention was still a novelty to folks who hadn't been issued one during the war. He didn't want to draw attention by consulting the time, which would be a giveaway that he was awake and planning a departure. As unobtrusively as possible, he used his index finger to raise his hat just far enough to gauge the degree of darkness beyond the opening. Since the last time he'd sneaked a look, the rectangular gap had turned from solid black to dull gray. Moving only his gaze, he looked toward the men who were a short distance away, lying at various angles to each other. 2 were snoring loudly, feigning sleep. 1, Thatcher could tell, was watching him through slitted eyelids. Thatcher lowered his finger from the underside of the brim. His hat resettled over his face. He forced himself to breathe evenly while he counted to 60. Then, in one motion, he lurched to his feet as he popped his hat onto his head and grabbed his duffel bag by the strap. He made it to the opening and hurled his bag out. Just as he was about to spring, one of the men grabbed his sleeve from behind. Shit. Thatcher came around and swung his fist toward the guy's head, but he saw it coming, ducked, and held on to Thatcher's sleeve like a bulldog. Out the corner of his eye, he saw another approaching in a crouch, making wide swipes with a knife. The man holding on to him threw a punch that caught Thatcher in the ribs. He retaliated by chopping the guy across the throat with the side of his hand. His attacker let go of his sleeve and staggered backward, holding his throat with both hands and wheezing. Thatcher spun around to the one with the knife. He had less than a second to throw up his hand to protect his face from being slashed. The sharp blade sliced across his palm. Thatcher yelped. The hobo grinned and charged. With his good hand, Thatcher caught hold of the vertical iron handle on the door and kicked the knifer in the balls. Dropping the knife, he screamed in agony, grabbed himself, dropped to his knees, then fell onto his side. Thatcher picked up the knife. The third in the group was poised to attack. Thatcher, winded, his cut hand hurting like bloody hell, said, "Call it quits, why don't you?" But the tramp didn't listen. He came up on his toes, preparing to lunge. Thatcher threw the knife end over end. The point pierced through the man's right shoe, nailing his foot to the floor of the boxcar. Thatcher turned and made a blind leap through the opening. As he went airborne, howled obscenities trailed him into the pre-dawn light as the train rumbled on. He landed on his feet, but his knees buckled at the jarring impact. Unable to break his fall, he tumbled down the incline, cussing the pounding he was taking from boulders and stumps. On one of his revolutions, he recognized the shape of a large agave, dead ahead and coming up fast. As he slid downhill toward it, he dug in his heels. They kicked up loose rocks and grit that struck him in the face, but he was able to stop within inches of being impaled by one of the plant's barbed spines. As the dust settled around him, he took mental stock of himself and determined that none of his limbs hurt bad enough to have been broken. His breathing was hard and fast, but it didn't hurt to suck in air, so no busted or sprained ribs, despite the blow he'd taken on one side. He wasn't dizzy, didn't feel like puking. Accepting that he was basically all right, except for his throbbing palm, adrenaline seemed to leak from his pores like sweat. He stayed as he was, lying there on his back, taking in his expansive and unobstructed view of the sky. It was turning paler by the second, causing the panoply of stars to dim, and he thought what a hell of a thing it was that he was still alive and could admire that sky. Then, as only one who had slept standing up in a trench while rats scuttled across his blood-soaked boots could do, he dropped into a deep sleep. He woke up to an early sun, but kept his eyes closed against its brightness, basking in the clean warmth of it on his face. He savored the stillness of the ground beneath him. He'd been unsteadily rocking for 2 days in that mother-loving boxcar. It had been almost as bad as the merchant marine freighter requisitioned and re-outfitted to ship troops home from Europe. If he never saw the Atlantic again, or a wave stronger than a ripple in a stock pond, it would be fine with him. After several minutes, he sat up. His vision was still clear, and he wasn't dizzy, although he had taken a clout to the head during his downhill plunge. A goose egg had formed on his right temple at his hairline. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and used it to wipe the blood away from the cut across his palm. It wasn't all that deep, but it made his hand ache. He wrapped the handkerchief around it. By the position of the sun, he figured out the directions. The landscape was dominated by rugged limestone outcroppings, some bare, some with live oak trees or cedar brakes seeming to grow straight out of the rock. Scrub brush, like that wicked-looking agave, dotted the shallow topsoil. He figured he was somewhere in the hill country, still hundreds of miles from home. He stood up and dusted himself off as best he could, then climbed the incline back to the tracks. The wind was southerly and warm, but strong. It had blown his hat off when he'd made the jump, but miraculously it was still there, lying in the railbed. He clamped it onto his head and pulled the brim down low over his eyes, then started walking along the tracks in the direction from which the train had come, until he reunited with his duffel bag. Shouldering it, he reversed his direction and continued in the northwesterly direction the train had been traveling. He saw no indication that a settlement of any kind was anywhere close. He didn't even see a road. The only living things he spotted were a small herd of cattle on a distant hill and 3 buzzards circling their breakfast, or what soon would be their breakfast. His stomach was gnawing at its own emptiness, but the only food left in his duffel were a few saltine crackers and the last of a hunk of cheddar. Eating them would make him thirsty, so he decided to hold off until he found water. He hiked along the tracks for an hour before he reached a crossing. A gravel road ran north and south, perpendicular to the tracks, extending for seeming miles in both directions without a turnoff. He took the northern route, hoping that he wouldn't have to hoof it for too long before someone came along who would give him a lift. The road was easier to walk on than the railbed, but the sky was cloudless, and the sun grew hotter than what you'd expect in mid-May. He shucked off his jacket and draped it over the duffel bag, unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt and rolled them up. Sighting a thin trail of smoke rising from behind one of the hills, he was tempted to go in search of the source. A ranch house or even a campsite could provide him with a drink of water. But the smoke was swiftly dispersed by the high wind, so he couldn't be certain how far away it was, and he was reluctant to go exploring off the beaten path. He was no stranger to living without a roof over his head, but he wasn't equipped to do so now. He estimated he'd walked 3 or 4 miles before he spotted a structure on the crest of a rise. At first it was only a dark dot, but the closer he got, it began to take shape. He smelled wood smoke, even though he didn't see any coming from the flue sticking out of the roof at an angle. A Model T was parked in front, along with a truck that looked like a junkyard on wheels. The place didn't look hospitable, but somebody was at home, and he was damn thirsty. He started up the dirt lane. As he got closer to the house, he saw that it wasn't a house at all, but a line shack, as ill-kempt a one as he'd ever seen. It must belong to a slipshod outfit that instilled no sense of pride in the cowboys who worked for it. However, it was no cowboy in the yard, but a young woman who was wrestling with a wet bedsheet. She was trying to get it onto a makeshift clothesline strung between the back corner of the shack and the outhouse. The strong wind was hampering her effort, but she was putting up a fight. He said, "The sheet is winning." 4. At the sound of his voice, she spun around, looking at him wide-eyed, her hand slapping against her chest where her breath seemed to have become trapped. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." Thatcher took off his hat. She recovered enough to close her mouth. In the process of hastily gathering up the flapping sheet, a corner of it dragged through the dirt, which made her frown. She dropped the sheet back into a cauldron of water, obviously her washpot. As she wiped her wet palms on the skirt of her dress, she looked beyond him toward the road. Coming back to him, she said, "Who are you?" "My name's Thatcher Hutton." "How'd you get here?" "Train." "There's no depot within miles of here. Why was the train stopped?" "It wasn't. I jumped off." Knowing what that implied about him, she raised her hand and shaded her eyes against the sun as she regarded him with even more wariness. "Out in the middle of nowhere?"
It was the lesser of two evils.
What was the other one?
The men sharing the boxcar with me bore a grudge.
The admission didn't earn him her favor.
So I see.
She looked pointedly at the goose egg on his temple and his bandaged hand. She squared her shoulders and motioned him toward the road.
Well, you live to tell of it. Get on now.
I've walked several miles, and your place here is the first sign of civilization I've seen. What's the nearest town?
Foley.
He'd heard of it, but had never been there. But he hadn't been much of anywhere before the war.
How far is it?
5 miles.
Tapping his hat against his leg, he glanced over his shoulder at the road.
5, huh?
At least.
I don't suppose you'd be going that way anytime soon?
He glanced toward the vehicles.
No, maybe you should have stayed on the train.
No, I needed to jump off.
How many of them were there?
In the boxcar? 3.
How did you get crosswise with them?
They got sore at me for taking their money.
You stole their money?
He shook his head. Wanted cards.
Did you cheat?
No.
She made a scoffing sound, expressing doubt.
It's true, I have a knack.
Still frowning with skepticism, she raised her arm and pointed toward the road.
Go north about 3 miles. At the crossroads, go east. It's a state highway that leads straight to town and becomes Main Street.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, move along.
Could you spare me a drink of water first?
She glanced toward the shack, seemed to debate it, then tilted her head.
Back here.
He set his duffel on the ground and piled his coat and hat on top of it. She led him past a chicken coop that looked relatively new. 2 hens were inside it, nesting. A rooster, strutting outside the coop, ruffled his feathers and challenged him and the woman with an aggressive beating of his wings. She told him to shoo or he'd find himself in a stew pot. On the back side of the shack, a rough wood bench leaned lengthwise against the exterior wall. A bucket of water was sitting on it, a dented metal ladle hanging on a nail above it.
Help yourself.
Thanks.
He lifted the ladle off the nail, dipped it into the bucket, and brought it to his mouth. The water was tepid, but it was wet. He wanted to gulp, but drank slowly in order to study her. Her dress was baggy, indicating that either it was a hand-me-down from a woman of more substance, or that there used to be more to her than there was now. There was nothing wrong with her shape, though. He'd noticed that each time the wind bonded the ill-fitting dress to her slender frame. Her hair was honey-colored, lighter around her face, and pulled into a bun worn low on the back of her head. The wind had pulled strands loose, which seemed to aggravate her because she kept impatiently trying to tuck them back in. In fact, her whole aspect was one of agitation. She was strung up a whole lot tighter than her clothesline. Before he finished drinking, she lost patience.
I've got to get back to my wash.
He drained the ladle and replaced it on the nail.
Much obliged.
You're welcome. She turned around and started back the way they'd come. He fell into step behind her. They were nearing the corner of the shack when the rooster came flapping around it with an angry squawk and tried to peck her hand. She recoiled, bumping into Thatcher. Instinctively, he caught her upper arms.
Did he get you?
Not this time.
But he has.
More than once.
The bird charged again. She flinched. Thatcher said, "Get!" The rooster, having established his superiority, strutted away. She eased herself free of Thatcher's hands, but turned her head to speak over her shoulder.
He's a wretched bird. I ought to ring.
Then she winced and came full around to face him. At first, Thatcher thought the rooster had pecked her after all, but it wasn't her hand she was grimacing over, it was his. When he'd clasped her arms, the handkerchief had come unwound, exposing the cut on his palm. She reached for his hand and held it supported in hers as she examined the cut, gently pressing the flesh on either side of it.
You should have that looked at. It could get...
She broke off when she looked up into his face and realized how close they were standing, how still he'd become, and how fixated he was on her face. She snatched her hand back, then with a swirl of her skirt, rounded the corner of the building out of sight. Thatcher blew out a long breath, wadded up the blood-stained handkerchief and stuffed it into his pants pocket, then followed her back to the washpot, where she was jabbing the contents with a stick as though punishing the soaking sheets. She didn't look at him. "I'll help you wring out that sheet and hang it on the line. It's my fault it got dirty again."
"No, thank you."
"It's the least I can do."
"No, thank you."
Her words were polite enough, but there was no mistaking her tone. She wanted him gone. He bent down, retrieved his hat, and put it on, then picked up his jacket and folded it over his arm. He lifted his duffel by the strap and was about to haul it onto his shoulder when he saw that he'd earned her notice after all. She'd stopped what she had been doing and was staring at his jacket where it lay across his arm. He fingered the torn seam that attached his sleeve, the one grabbed and held onto as he'd made his escape.
"It was ripped during the altercation."
She gave her head a slight shake.
"It's not the tear. I noticed the buttons."
"Oh, they're keepsakes from off my army uniform."
When he'd mustered out, the army had reclaimed his uniform for reasons never explained. Did they expect another war to break out soon? Were they going to pass down his mud and blood-stained uniform to the next guy they drafted into service? He never knew. But before he'd relinquished the uniform, he'd ripped off the dull brass buttons bearing insignias. As soon as he'd acquired a suit of civilian clothes, he'd swapped out the buttons. He ran his fingertip over the one with an embossed pair of crossed rifles and the capital letter B.
"The 360th Infantry Regiment, all us draftees from Texas and Oklahoma."
"Yes, I know."
She spoke with a huskiness to her voice that hadn't been there before.
"B Company."
"You know someone who served in it?"
"My husband."
Her eyes flicked up to his, then away as she resumed swishing the water in the cauldron.
"He make it back?"
"Yes."
She kept her head down and didn't elaborate, but he'd had his question answered. He hoisted the duffel bag onto his shoulder.
"I'll need a place to stay in town. Any suggestions?"
She was about to shake her head when she hesitated, as though remembering.
"In the window of Hancock's store, there's a sign advertising a room."
"Where's the store?"
"You can't miss it."
"Laurel?"
Startled, she looked in the direction of the shack from where the man's voice had come.
"I'm here," she called.
"The baby's coughing again."
Just then, a baby's wail could be heard coming from inside. The woman propped her stick against the lip of the washpot and started toward the door of the shack. As she rushed past Thatcher, she said,
"Be on your way now."
"Thanks for the water."
Before she disappeared inside, he said,
"Wait, what was that name again?"
She paused in the open doorway and looked back at him.
"Hancock's."
"No, your name."
"Oh, Laurel. Plumber."
5. As Laurel rushed inside, she nearly ran directly into Irv, who was standing just beyond the threshold, but far enough back in the shadows that he couldn't be seen from the yard. He held a double-barreled shotgun crosswise against his chest. He raised his index finger to his lips, signaling for her not to make a sound. She went over to the crib that Irv had made for Pearl out of scrap lumber he'd salvaged from one of his fix-it jobs. Her daughter's face was near purple from crying and coughing. Laurel picked her up and held her against her shoulder as she firmly patted her back, trying to loosen the phlegm that had made her croupy for more than a week. Irv remained stock still, watching the stranger until he had reached the road and headed in the direction Laurel had told him would lead to Foley. Only then did Irv relax his stance. He returned the shotgun to its usual spot, resting it between two hooks mounted above the door. Laurel said,
"He hopped off a freight car and wasn't sure of where he was."
"That's what he told you anyway."
"Why would he lie?"
"Any number of reasons, and none of them good."
He startled me but apologized for it. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt compelled to defend the stranger. He was mannerly.
That's the worst sort. They sneak up on you and act like your friend.
The worst sort of what?
Of anything. How many times have I told you to be suspicious of strangers out this far? He could have been up to all kinds of mischief.
He was only asking for directions and a drink of water.
You must have had the thirst of a damn camel. What took so long?
While we were back there, the rooster made a nuisance of himself.
She thought the less said about that incident, the better. The mean rooster had been the least of it. She'd known what to expect from that damn bird. Her thoughts lingered now on what had come after. She hadn't touched a man, or vice versa, since Derby's death, not even Irv. Despite the stranger's leanness, he'd felt as solid as a tree trunk when she'd backed into him. When he'd steadied her with his hands on her arms, she'd had a momentary yearning to lean against him. It hadn't lasted any longer than the flit of a butterfly's wings, so it didn't merit dwelling on now. She forced herself to tune into Irv's grumbling.
He didn't look like any hobo I ever saw.
Not to Laurel either.
No, but he looked like a man who jumped off a train. His clothes were dusty. He had a ripped sleeve and a bruised bump on his forehead and a cut on his hand.
She didn't want to think at all about that business with his hand. Any woman in the world would have responded the same way to seeing a nasty cut like that. She'd reacted in a typically female way, instinctually, maternally. Although held in her palm, his hand hadn't felt like that of a child.
What was that hogwash about saving his army buttons?
Seeing them had been a bleak reminder of Derby's uniform hanging abandoned in the empty closet. She hadn't told Irv about that, and saw no point in telling him now. It would only make him sad.
"The man was just passing by, Irv," she said. "For heaven's sake. Really, you're making too much of it."
And you're not making enough. I've lived longer. I've learned to be more cautious, less friendly.
He indicated the shotgun.
I'll teach you how to shoot in case a vagrant, who ain't so mannerly, comes along when I'm not here watching your back.
She would be unable to reach the shotgun without dragging something over to the door and standing on it. By the time she did that, her throat could have been cut. So, not to give Irv another reason to fret, she didn't cite that. Instead, she gave a small nod of acquiescence. He started for the door.
You tend to Pearl. I'll hang that wash.
"The wash can wait. I want to talk to you."
His shoulders slumped as he turned back to her.
If it's about moving into town...
It is. Let's have this out. Sit down, please.
With obvious reluctance, he went over to a lidded barrel on which he'd placed a cushion to form a seat for himself. He often perched there instead of sitting in a chair. Laurel guessed it was easier on his hip. She sat down at the small table at which they ate their meals. Pearl's horrible barking cough had subsided since she'd picked her up. Laurel laid her cheek against the top of Pearl's head.
"Her hair's damp. I think her fever finally broke."
That's good. She coughed all night long.
"I'm sorry."
Hell, Laurel, I ain't cross over losing sleep.
Watching Pearl, he furrowed his brow.
Pains me to hear that cough. Poor little thing.
Unwittingly, he had given Laurel an opening.
"I want to talk to you about a couple of things. Well, 3, actually."
He folded his arms over his middle.
What's the first?
"Thank you."
That took him aback.
What for?
"That night we showed up here, you could have sent us on our way. You could have put up a real fuss with Derby for springing us on you. You didn't. I don't think you'll ever know how much I appreciated your kindness that night and these 2 months since. You haven't complained once about Pearl and me being foisted off on you."
He snorted.
You could have took one look at me and this place and raised more than a fuss, Laurel. You could have raised bloody hell, and Derby deserved it.
They'd buried him in Foley's municipal cemetery. At the gravesite were only the 2 of them, Pearl, and the undertaker, whom Irv had paid an extra 50 cents to read a suitable scripture and say a prayer. In the weeks following, She and Irv grieved Derby privately, silently, neither speaking of him, because they had no shared memory except for the final few minutes of his life. Neither wanted to reminisce on those. Laurel's bereavement had been, and still was, far from pure and holy. It was corrupted by outrage. Were Derby's last words to her, "You'll thank me later," supposed to atone for his cowardly, selfish desertion of her and Pearl? His defection from all responsibility? Willfully, she tamped down the resentment that continued to smolder even now, 2.5 months into her widowhood. If ever she allowed it to boil, it would consume her. She lifted Pearl off her shoulder and placed her face down across her knees, swaying them slowly from side to side.
Irv, is this the start of the second thing?
Yes.
Well, let's hear it.
She began by saying that it would be better for all of them to live at least within shouting distance of town. I'm sure we could find a place to rent. Nothing fancy, but with separate rooms for us. Pearl and I wouldn't always be underfoot. You'd have your privacy back. She looked at the blankets he'd strung up around the mattress. He now slept on a pallet of old quilts, which he'd placed crosswise against the door, as far away from her corner as possible. The makeshift curtains served to keep them out of sight of each other during the night, but it was a fragile barrier against the forced intimacy and each other's humanness. He didn't argue her point, so she pressed on. You could take twice as many jobs if you didn't have to drive that 10-mile round trip each day. That takes up valuable time. And I worry about that truck of yours breaking down and stranding you on some back road. If you went missing, I wouldn't know where to start looking for you.
My truck runs just fine.
Then why are you tinkering on it all the time?
When he didn't answer, she continued.
I'll find something to do that will bring in extra money.
He lowered his bushy brows.
Like what?
She knew that money would be a primary concern, rightly so. There were jobs to be had working in the oil patches that were sprouting up in northwest Texas, some not far from here. But an older man with a gimp hip and a woman with an infant hardly qualified them to be roughnecks, even if they desired to be. She would have to come up with something she could do at home. Take in laundry and ironing. Teach illiterate adults how to read. She wasn't without skills or resources. She decided to admit now that the cash Derby had on him the night of their arrival wasn't all that they'd had to their name.
I have some cash tucked away that Derby didn't know about. I've been saving it for a rainy day, and this is it.
Her father-in-law took umbrage, but not from knowing she'd secreted money from Derby.
I have you know that I ain't destitute, and the idea of taking money from a woman, a young widow woman at that, makes...
Would you rather Pearl learn to crawl on a dirt floor?
He scowled and muttered something unseemly under his breath.
Why do you live here, Irv?
Because I like it.
You couldn't possibly like it.
It suits me just fine.
Well, it doesn't suit me. I don't want my daughter growing up in a dilapidated shack with cracks in the walls, out in the middle of nowhere, cut off from everything and everybody. No telephone or electricity or running water. No other children. No other people except for the two of us. What kind of upbringing is that?
She stopped before she got too fired up. It wasn't her intention to insult or shame him into compliance. More gently, she said,
I'll be forever grateful to you for taking us in, but the baby and I can't go on living like this.
Weren't so much of a hardship on me having y'all here, he said. I'd miss you something fierce if you was to leave now, but I get what you're saying.
He thought on it for a time, then said,
You're a pretty girl, Laurel. A bit scrawny, but that hobo was appreciating you. Don't think I didn't notice how he was eyeing you. If you fix yourself up a bit, fill out a little, you'll find another husband in no time, is my guess.
She gave a bitter laugh.
I don't want another husband, thank you. Not ever.
You say that now, but...
I'm not looking for a man, Irv, so put that thought right out of your head.
You gals got the vote? You don't need men no longer?
She leveled a look on him.
It's way past time we gals got the vote, but you're only saying that to rile me, so I'll drop this subject. I'm not falling for it.
He mumbled more swear words, then sat with arms folded, glowering as he considered his next line of attack. Laurel waited him out. Finally, he said,
A well-heeled family in town would probably give you a roof in exchange for housekeeping and cooking, like that.
Not with a baby.
But if they've got little ones?
I don't want to live with another family and take care of their children. Besides, we should stay together, help each other.
She knew better than to remind him that he wasn't getting any younger.
We're family.
Laurel gazed at her gruff and scruffy father-in-law, who her own father would consider hellbound for taking an occasional nip of moonshine for medicinal purposes, but who had been so ungrudgingly charitable.
You're my family now, Irv, but whether or not you come with Pearl and me, I must leave here and somehow build a life for us.
He drew a deep breath and exhaled it slowly.
At least tell me you understand my reasoning, Laurel said.
I ain't dense.
Then, is that a yes? We'll start looking in town for a place to live?
I'm thinking on it,
he said grouchily.
What's the third thing under discussion?
No discussion to it. You're going to teach me how to drive.
When she saw that he was about to object, she added,
Today.
6. On this Saturday afternoon, country folk had come to town. Main Street and Foley was heavily trafficked with automobiles, trucks, and horse or mule-drawn wagons, top-heavy with everything from bales of hay to prolific families. Hancock's General Goods was a 3-story brick building. Its imposing facade dominated a block of the thoroughfare. In one of its 4 display windows were a pyramid of canned peas and carrots, several unfurled bolts of checked gingham in a rainbow of colors, a rack of Winchester rifles, and an open red metal toolbox showing off a set of shiny wrenches. The merchandise obscured the pale blue card stuck in the bottom corner of the window frame. It looked to Thatcher like it had been there for a while. The black ink had faded to brown, but the printed words were still legible. Room for let to single, 312 Pecan Street. Thatcher waylaid a man who was about to enter the store. He was jowly and prosperous looking. His pocket watch dangled from a thick gold chain threaded through a buttonhole on his vest.
Excuse me.
Thatcher drew the man's attention to the sign.
Can you aim me toward that address?
The man took a backward step and sized him up. New to town?
Just rolled in.
The gentleman glanced again at the sign. And apparently planning to stay.